Good morning, everyone. This is Lana Hunt, Director of IPMG's Communication and Professional Development, and welcome to our March informational webinar. I'm very excited about our speaker and about the topic today, which I think is very important, and you will find it's very good information. But before I introduce Dr. Glassburn, I do have a few things that I just want to go over. Just a few reminders. There will be a survey that will populate at the end of today's webinar, and we really do appreciate your feedback. That helps us to plan future webinars and to ensure that we are providing the professional development content that is meaningful to all of you. The link to the survey will also be included in the follow-up email that all attendees will receive within 2 business days. So if you're not able to take the time to do it at the end of today's webinar, it will be in the link that you receive in the follow-up email. And in that follow-up email will be a certificate of attendance. So if you are attending today and need to provide a certificate in order to receive professional development credits, that will be available to you within that email. We also are recording today's webinar, and the recording along with any associated materials will be available within 2 business days at IPMG's website, and that's go to ipmg.com. You can look in the resources section under informational webinars. You'll be able to access this webinar along with the archive of previous webinars. So we hope that you take advantage of that resource. So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Susan Glassburn. And Dr. Glassburn is an assistant professor and has been a clinical social worker for over 30 years. She has been teaching at the Indiana University School of Social Work since 2004 in the Masters of Social Work program. She teaches counseling skills and healthcare social work courses. Her work experience includes being a mental health clinician, a clinical manager in home health care, and a bereavement coordinator in a hospice program. She is currently interested in compassion, fatigue, and burnout, interprofessional teamwork, and geriatric social work. She is the current president for the Indiana Network of Healthcare Social Workers. She is an empty nester and has an active Siberian Husky and is constantly covered in dog fur, and I can definitely relate to that as I am as well. So it is my pleasure to now turn this over to Susan for her presentation. And I'm going to be changing the presenter over, and you should be ready to go.
Great. Okay. You have a complicated little system here about showing slides, so I have to figure that.
That's all right. We do see your screen, so if you just go to your PowerPoint that you have, it should then be able to show that.
Yes. Okay. I want to make sure I show the presenter view here. Okay, let's see. Okay, so you can see the slides all right then?
We can, yes, you are ready.
Yeah, I am like very Zoom proficient, so this like WebConnects thing, I'm like, what are you all doing? You're tricking me now. You're making me new technology that I do not know. So there we go. All right. Well, it's so nice of you all to have me here today. I really appreciate you inviting me to talk about a topic that I'm actually really passionate about, and that is about grief. And I know it's maybe not the most exciting topic to, well, let me say it's maybe a bit of a difficult topic, so I'll say that. But I also think it's a really important topic. I just want to take a moment to respect all of you who came today who are actively grieving. I'm sure since we have a big audience today, there are those of you who've lost a loved one, who maybe very recently, and maybe you've lost a pet very recently, a friend, a sibling, And so I know this topic may be a little tender for you. So feel free while I'm talking to go to your happy place, make your grocery list, go get a drink, and hopefully come back and join us. I hope the things that you hear today and learn today will be helpful to you and will also help you help someone else that's grieving. And whether that's a client or whether that's a friend or a family member, that would be wonderful. So let's start off here, and I wanted to tell you just a little bit about me before we begin. There's the furry husky that Stephanie did get to see in full-blown action mode yesterday, leaping around behind me. So she's at dog daycare. But a little bit about me, like you heard that I am a social work professor at IUPUI, but I also was, I worked in hospice for 5 years before I came to the School of Social Work, and I was actually a bereavement coordinator, which is a weird name, right? And a bereavement coordinator, basically, hospice is required that you provide grief follow-up for people, like for, a year, up to a year after their loved one died. And that means doing support groups, making home visits to people who might be having a difficult time, doing grief newsletters. And I did actually see some hospice patients too before they passed, but my primary work was with grief. And what's really interesting is that, when I worked in hospice, I'd already been a social worker for quite some time. And I thought, okay, hospice, grief work, I got this. I knew the Kubler-Ross stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, blah, blah, blah. Well, when I got into really work with grief work, I realized I didn't know anything at all. And that Kubler-Ross stuff is for people that are dying. And it's not for people in grief. They really didn't necessarily apply. So I had to really throw out the window what I thought I knew about grief and be open to what people's experiences really were. And so that was an eye-opener. So what I've learned about grief now is kind of a combination of professional knowledge, going to workshops, reading books. I teach a class in grief and loss. And the other part of it was just personal experience and listening and being humble and throwing my own pre-existing judgments out the window. So what you're going to hear today is a little bit of a mix of clinical stuff I know and like just earned wisdom on the job. So let's start and talk a little about what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about normal grief, which is a weird word. I know, normal grief. I'd say normal because it distinguishes it from grief that is a little more complicated or where there's a problem. So we're going to talk about normal grief. And then what's complicated grief, which means grief that sort of goes wrong in some way or is much more intense. And then I want to give you some concrete ideas that you can take with you about how to help people with uncomplicated grief. We're going to leave the complicated stuff for people who are grief experts, but I want you to have some ideas about how to just help people with normal grief and hopefully help yourself as well too. All right, I love this quote, and if you bear with me, I will read to you, but I love this quote, and I think it really symbolizes how I see grief. You will lose someone you can't live without, and your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up. And you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, that still hurts when the weather gets cold. But you learn to dance with the limp. And that is definitely the way I feel about grief. If you would go back to normal, that would not even be honoring the place that they had in your life. So we're going to talk about like real grief is, like I said, really different from what sort of the United States conception of how we do things in our drive-through, get over it kind of culture, right? There's a pill for that, So what is normal grief? So normal grief means that it's a common human experience. It's what everybody goes through. So it usually doesn't turn into like a serious depression or contain suicidal ideation or an inability to function. But it's horrible, right? Like normal grief is really painful. And there is a huge range of fluctuating emotions, sad and overwhelming thoughts, and even body reactions. That's what is amazing to me about grief, is that it affects your mind, your body, your emotions, and your spirit. It's a total body workout, not in, not in a great way, but it affects all of you. So we're going to talk about a little bit more about some of the things that do happen in grief, some common thoughts and experiences. I just want you to look at this list. These are all normal things. And there's a lot on here. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them that I think are interesting. One of them is guilt. And guilt or regrets, or I call it the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, is a very common thing where people will, if only I would have called the doctor sooner, if only I would have visited them more, I should have been a better friend. I wish I would have known what was coming. I just would have been more present, right? And I know we as well-meaning friends and coworkers want to talk people out of their guilt. And I think it's okay to give them yes, but, you did what you could. And I think that's okay. But I think it doesn't really fix it. People have to come to their own place of letting it go. I think it's so normal. I think for most people, there's the shoulda, coulda, woulda zone that happens early on in grief. So I've just learned to listen to that and respond. And I'll kind of give you a technique that you can use later on that's really helpful. But also, look at some of these feelings. They're intense, right? Denial, anger, frustration. And denial is not a bad thing. Denial gets a bad rap. Denial is your body's ability to kind of take a break from experiencing reality. And so sometimes people need to back away a little bit and just kind of hide in a hole for a minute. And people don't usually stay there, but if we take away people's denial, you need to accept this. You need to realize this is the real deal, and they will. They don't need to be slapped over the head with it. So denial can be a helpful place, because if you take denial away, sometimes what's underneath it is panic. That's not pretty. The other one I think that is really an interesting thing that people will say is the desire to die. And it's kind of scary. I don't know if you have heard someone say this to you. You'll hear it a lot with older adults. Like if someone loses a partner that they've had for many years, they'll just say, I don't even know why I'm here. I just wish the good Lord would take me. I don't really want to wake up in the morning. I just wish I didn't have to go on. And you're like, oh my gosh, they're suicidal. And you should always ask, right? You should always say, are you, do you have a plan? Are you thinking about it? What would you do if you were going to end your life? You need to go there. But a lot of times they're like, oh no, honey, I'm not going to hurt myself. I just don't know why I'm still here. And it's usually about meaning and purpose. And when we lose our meaning in life, the reason we get up in the morning, it's hard to go on. And so when they've lost their person that they've had forever, of course they're going to have a crisis of meaning. And that to me is what it's about, is a crisis of meaning rather than an active attempt to kill themselves. But you always have to ask and go there. You can never assume either way, right? But it is not an uncommon thing. And I know that used to really upset me when I was starting to do grief work, when people would say stuff like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to do something. I got to get an intervention. I got to get a plan. What are we doing? So now I take a deep breath and I ask the follow-up questions. And then if I don't think there's any imminent suicidal reaction, I just listen to that, right? Because it is about meaning and it's about pain. Some people have relief. You can't really ever make any assumptions about how people feel. I know I saw a woman who took care of her husband for a long time before he died, and she put off having a knee replacement because she was a caregiver. And so when she finally, he dies, she goes and has her knee done as soon as she possibly could. And so I thought, oh man, this poor woman, here she is, her husband dies, now she's having a knee replacement, she's in the hospital. So I called her up and she's like, yeah, come over and visit. And so I'm thinking about all this. And then when I get there, I was like, oh, this is a lot for you, going through the knee thing and kind of grieving. And she's like, oh, honey, we had a terrible relationship. He was a really difficult man. He never let me spend a dime. She says, I'm going to have my knee done and I'm going on a cruise in 6 months. I was like, okay, well, another lesson for me that I can never assume how people feel, that I need to go in with a blank slate and let them tell me. And she felt some real relief. And, relief can go, if you're taking care of someone with Alzheimer's or someone with a serious disability, relief could be a very common reaction to loss. And it's one of many. It may not be the primary one, but it may be there and people feel guilty about that. So sometimes validating that it's okay to feel some relief is also a good thing. Let's talk about some normal physical or behavioral reactions. Again, giant list, right? These are all normal things. It's a lot of stuff that happens to you in grief. One of them is absent-mindedness that I was going to highlight. Sometimes when I'm driving, in traffic, there's a lot of cars around me. I think the odds are that there's somebody grieving right next to me. And I know when I've been in grief or when I have lost someone, like I think 98% of my brain is processing that loss. And like it only gives me 2% to like walk, chew gum, drive, figure out what I'm having for dinner. And so I know I have memories of like I would drive home and I have no memory of driving home because my brain was just so consumed with what I was trying to process. So I think about that while I'm driving, like there's probably some grieving people out here who are just not even processing, right? But that absent-mindedness is a real thing, not being able to concentrate. A lot of times people's immune systems just kind of tank. They get colds more easily. Because again, your body is just besieged with this loss that has happened to you. You can see on the other side, there's some more like behavioral things, dreams or nightmares, calling out the deceased name or talking to the deceased, talking out loud to them, very normal. Like people get a little freaked out about that. Like, what's happening here? Is this like a made for, reality TV show here? What's happening? No, super common. I think the one I want to talk about is the one that's highlighted that says hallucinations of the deceased or sensing their presence. All right, deep breath on this one. When I've done grief support groups, usually someone will sort of tentatively say, hey, this weird thing happened to me. Like I was at home and I know I smelled my husband's cologne, or I felt like a hand on my shoulder. Or they'll talk about animal stories, like there was a hummingbird and it just followed me around, for like a week or so. And I knew that was my husband just telling me that I was okay, or he was okay. So never interpret those, never brush those off. I don't know what happens, right? I love to think that some people get some reassurance, but then in a grief group, it's hard because not everybody has that happen to them. And so some people are like, well, why didn't my grandma come to me? Well, my husband apparently didn't care enough to send me a hummingbird, right? Or so I don't know, like, I don't know why some people have them and I don't know why some people don't, but for whatever reason, they do happen and they're super normal. So make sure that if it's helpful to the person, I always say, well, that must have felt very reassuring. I validate that for them. Like that must be really reassuring. That must have been great. Most people find them comforting. It's really rare to have someone who doesn't find them comforting. Most people feel like it was great that I got some communication. And I have so many stories. I should write a book. Working in hospice, I have lots of stories about all these, and I could spend the entire time telling you cool stories, but I will not. So I will move on. So here's just some things from me about what you might know, what you might not know about normal grief. Labeled clinically with some stuff you might not know. There you go. That's a clinical word. So one thing that's helpful to me is thinking about how grief and mourning are different experiences. So it helps me because I think grief is all your feelings and emotions that you process on the inside, the sadness, the anger, all the stuff that you feel. Mourning is grief gone public. It's the behaviors you do. It's what you say, what you do, how you act. And usually people who have a hard time in the process are the people who only grieve and do not mourn. Doing things helps you, and that might be going to the cemetery. Some people are like, nope, not doing that, that's creepy. Other people, it's helpful. Some people look at pictures. Sometimes, most of the time we just talk. I don't know if you're like me, but I will talk you to death. If I have a loss, if I have something happen to me in my life, I'm an extrovert. I externally process things, and that's what I do. I think grief needs a witness. I think it's very hard to process your stuff without another person. I mean, maybe there are people who just journal and do that. That's mourning too. Journaling is mourning, but I think most of us need someone to talk to. And I mentioned this already, there's no getting back to normal. There's only adjusting to a new normal. We don't use the C word in grief, closure. Nope, not the word we say. We talk about integration of loss, right? Because when you have someone, I'm talking about when you lose someone in your inner circle, Like we all have circles of people in our lives. If you lose an inner circle person, you know, a parent, a friend, a pet, those are inner circle people that are like huge part of your life. Your life doesn't go back to normal. You are really struggling with trying to live a life now without that person that was so meaningful to you. You lose someone that is not in that inner circle, that's in another one of those concentric circles out from you. It still impacts you, but it may not impact your day-to-day function, and you may not have some of the reactions that I'm talking about today. So when I talk about grief and loss today, it's sort of about that loss of that inner circle person. Grief bursts are real. Grief bursts are where you have this random intense burst of grief. You can think like life is fine, you're just hanging out, and all of a sudden you have a memory or something triggers it. People have them in the grocery store. They see like the box of cereal that their wife loved, or their, you know, they see something that's in a recipe that their great aunt made that they were really close to, and they just start to sob in the grocery store, right? It's a common place where people have grief bursts. But people feel like it's an indication that they're not doing something well, or that they're not healing. They're like, oh, if I was doing better, I wouldn't be having these grief bursts. I'm like, oh, no, you will have grief bursts, and you may have grief bursts for years, but they usually get less frequent and less intense over time. I do want to say I don't believe time heals all wounds. I believe it's what you do with the time that heals the wounds. And I think that's an important thing. It's not a passive process. In grief, you have to actively do things to help yourself move forward. The going crazy syndrome is really something so common. I heard this all the time. People would say to me, like kind of pull me in confidence, like, Susan, I think there's something wrong with me. It's been like 4 months since my husband died, and I'm getting worse instead of better. Like, I feel terrible. I'm just like crying all the time. And I'm like, nope, this is how it is. This is the real deal. Because, you know, you don't get a book like when you're pregnant, they have that what to expect when you're expecting book. You don't really usually get a book about what to expect when you're grieving. But there are some great books out there that help you do that. Usually you just can't read in the beginning because you can't focus. But there are some guidebooks. But people don't realize that you get worse before you get better. Because in the first couple of months, you've still got some shock and denial, and your brain is not processing. Well, sometime after the chicken casseroles stop coming and the sympathy cards aren't showing up in your mailbox anymore, that's when real grief hits. And you realize this is permanent. It's not going away. I have to live my life without this person. And how am I going to do that? So it's worse and more intense. And people think it's that there's something wrong with them. Like, I'm doing something wrong, or I would be feeling better. I'm like, no, this is how it really is. So this is when, if you have someone you know right now in your life that's grieving and they lost somebody 3 to 6 months ago, they still need a card, they still need a call, hey, maybe a chicken casserole, whatever, but they need something, because this is when it's rough. And then it sort of builds from there. I think that was such a surprise to me. I had this like idea when I first started thinking I knew about grief that, you know, it was really terrible in the beginning, but every day it got a little bit better. Well, no, it just is like a roller coaster, right? That's more of a metaphor for grief than that sort of like straight up line that I thought it was. So that going crazy syndrome is real. Some people cry, normal. Some people don't cry a lot. That can be normal too. So my next thing is just being very cautious and judging what people do to grieve. How do we say what's normal in grief? It's usually because we use ourselves as the measuring stick. Like, how did people grieve? What role models for grief did you have growing up? Did people express their emotions, or did they kind of suck it up and look really stoic? Did they talk about it? Did they wail? Did they mourn? Did they drink? Did they have wild wakes and funerals? I mean, everybody's culturally grown up in some sort of a way, and that's how we think this is normal. And so we judge, we're like Judgy McJudgersons about somebody else's life. Like, ooh, you know, they're kind of like doing a little too much crying or a little too much. I would have like adult children call me and say, Susan, please go out and see our dad. We just think he's not doing well. I'm like, well, what's your dad doing? Well, you know, he and my mom had these 2 recliners that face the TV, and now she's been gone like 6 months, and he still looks over and talks to the empty recliner like she's there, and it freaks us out. I'm like, how long were your parents married? 47 years. I'm like, and how long has this been since she died? Oh, it's maybe about a year now. I'm like, that's pretty normal. like 47 years and it's only been a year and your dad is still integrating this loss. You know, is your dad functioning? Is he paying his bills? Is he doing what he needs to do? And is he like mentally, you know, cognitively with it? Is he physically doing okay? Like, yeah. Then, okay, let him do it. Who's it hurting? Like, you know, don't judge it. So that is something I learned too. Be very careful. Now, having said that, I will say there are people I do judge. If you take your partner's cremains with you everywhere you go in an urn and you're carrying them on the airplane and all that, and then I'll be like, okay, I'm judging you now. I'm judging you. This is not cool. So who, you know, it is hard, right? Sometimes it's hard to know what is normal and what's not, and sometimes you need a professional to help you. So having said that, I'm very generous about not judging people. There are people that I'll be like, from the get-go, you need some help, right? You need some support. One thing to think about with grief is that the whole goal of it is to not forget it, to not close the book, to not move forward. The goal is to just remember your loved one without so much pain, but to remember them instead of just like closing the chapter. I always think people talk about closure, moving on. Moving on means moving with them, not moving on from them. All right, now you got my rants. You got my rants about grief now. Here's a quote that I love. I mentioned Alan Wofeld, who is a brilliant grief guy, a book that I love him. He's from Indiana. He has a Center for Loss and Life Transition in Colorado, writes a lot of great stuff. If you want some really good books that are practical about grief and helpful, I love his stuff. I love this quote. He talks about how in the United States, we're kind of a nutty culture. He says, when it comes to healing after the death of someone, our culture has it all wrong. We're told to be strong when what we really need is to be vulnerable. We're told to think positive when what we really need is to wallow in the pain. And we're told to seek closure when what we really need is to welcome our natural and necessary grief. I think that's so true. People, we kind of have like a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, suck it up, keep moving forward culture. But there is no healing in grief without experiencing the pain of it. There is really no way to get around that. I wish I could tell you there was a magical way to do that, but there's not. If you want to talk about clinical stuff, this is more theory. So if you hate theory, go get a drink right now, run to the bathroom really fast. It'll just be one slide. But theory about grief now is called the dual process model. And this is a great drawing about how grief really works. Isn't this a messy, ugly picture? That's because grief is kind of messy and ugly. Basically, what is this saying is that the process of healing over time is an oscillation between two things, between loss-oriented coping and restoration-oriented coping. So everybody has to do the grief work. It intrudes on your life. You have to figure it out. You have to like feel that pain. And then you at the same time, you got to get on with your life. You got to pay your bills. You got to get groceries. You have to figure out who you are now that the person is not in your life. You may have to do new things you've never done before. You got to manage an estate. You have to take care of all of that, you know, legal junk. So you're oscillating back and forth all the time between grief and moving forward. And over, you know, in the beginning, it's all grief, right? And not a lot of moving forward. But over time, it becomes more moving forward. But the grief is always there. That kind of always fluctuates, you know. The nice thing about grief is that in the beginning, it intrudes and you cannot block it out. But over time, you choose to visit it. You can choose to reflect and remember and be sad. In the beginning, you have no choice. You're sort of a prisoner. But I like this drawing because it really talks about like grief is messy. Okay, done with the theory. Those of you who went to go get a beverage, hopefully you're back. All right, let's talk about complicated grief. And it's different than what we talked about. Some of those, I mean, normal grief can look wild, right? Like I was telling you, like it's a wide range of stuff. Complicated grief are situation, it's kind of a perfect storm of situation and personal qualities of the griever that make grief complicated. They used to call it pathological grief. Isn't that a horrible label? Like you're pathological? Like, yike. I like complicated grief because it just says your grief process is going to be more complicated. And these are the people who probably need counselors and professional grief people to help them, right? They on their own may get stuck. So if you have a loved one die by suicide, and I know now we don't say commit suicide, we say because it has that sort of like a stigma of like it's illegal. It used to be like illegal back in the, like, 100 years ago. So we still use that commit suicide like a crime, like you commit a crime. So now we try to say died by suicide, or if your loved one was a victim of homicide, or a child that died from abuse, or an adult from domestic violence. If you had a difficult relationship with the person who died, it's very conflictual, or you were very dependent on each other, like together, the two of you like made a whole. Those are things that may predispose you to have complicated grief. And like I said, the other thing is the personal characteristics of the griever could make it complicated. Like the grief, the way the person died is not so complicated, but if you have a significant history for depression or trauma, PTSD, or some abandonment stuff, your grief may just be more complicated because of what you bring to the table. So like I said, complicated grief is grief that needs extra help. And really, it's a small percentage of people that really need that extra help, like 5 to 10%. Although for older adults, it can be higher because oftentimes they have fewer physical supports, resources. They may have a lot of loss. By the time you're an older person, you've got a lot of cumulative losses of people, health, maybe living situations, all kinds of things. So it can be a little more complicated sometimes for them. But complicated grief, we call it prolonged grief, or it basically impairs your life functioning. And there are 4 kinds of complicated mourning. I use the words interchangeably, complicated grief. One is chronic. So these are the folks who just like are sort of in the first part of it being really difficult. Like they just are sort of always in that place of not feeling like they're moving forward. They're very stuck. Like it feels very fresh to them even years later. And it's like they are never really, they're sort of like arrested development, in that sense about moving on with their life. There are people who delay grief, like they don't feel anything for a couple of years and then suddenly it hits, or there's just they just don't really express grief. They're just, nope, I'm fine, moving on, thanks, it's okay. No, I'm not, I'm handling it great, no problem. Exaggerated grief are people who perhaps do really, like I said, are much more distressed. They are really having a difficult time. They may manifest a lot of physical, emotional symptoms. So it may just be that they are, people who really look like they're grieving. And these are not, you cannot diagnose complicated grief for a long time. Like people need several months. Everybody looks complicated in the beginning. It's over time that you decide who needs additional help and who doesn't. I mean, there are some people from the get-go that you're like the person that would carry the urn around for 2 years, even on an airplane. That was a real story. Not cool. But, for most of us, it takes a while to decide. Mass grief is like people who don't realize that their grief is affecting them. Like maybe they have a lot of physical symptoms. Sometimes people, our grievers, will have the same symptoms as their loved ones who died. Like if somebody died from a heart attack, they may have a lot of chest pain, even though they don't have any physical reason for it, but they may take on that physical symptom. Or they may act out, do crazy stuff like risky behaviors, spending a lot of money, and they're really just trying to like deal with their grief, but it's coming out in some sort of behavioral way. And when someone makes the connection, like, you're working yourself to death, and I think this is a grief thing, and they're like, oh, like sometimes people need someone else to help them put that together. But those are different types of complicated mourning. Again, I could talk about those all day, and you're like, thank God you're not, because we need to have a life too, Susan. So here's a couple of case studies really quickly, and I will read them real fast and we'll talk about if they're normal or complicated grief. Daniel's 43, lost his husband 4 years ago. They'd been married for 8 years. Daniel took all the photos of them together down right away when Jamal died in a car accident. He gave away Jamal's things 1 week later. He went back to work 3 days later after the death, and he hasn't taken a vacation since. He works a lot and he doesn't talk about Jamal much at all. When his family or friends ask how he's doing, he says he's fine, that he's doing great. No one has seen him cry or break down. He doesn't call or talk to Jamal's family and has cut them out of his life. Normal or complicated grief? This is pretty complicated, right? He basically is doing that delayed or absent grief thing. Like He's just sort of working, keeping his head down and trying not to think about it. He's trying to figure out how to avoid the pain, which does not work. I mean, it would be great if it did work, but grief is like pay me now or pay me later. So you either go through the experience of it. If you delay it, I do think it'll be harder for you. It's going to come out at some point in physical manifestations where you're going to get physically sick, or you're going to have some emotional stuff that will happen. So, and it may be a long time where he, you know, until he has to pay the piper, but eventually it's hard. So that's complicated. Maria is 37 and lost her mother last Memorial Day cancer. That was about 6 months ago. They were very close and talk daily. Maria cries alone and with friends and family at least 2 to 3 times a week now. She feels sick at her stomach some days and has missed a few days of work when she feels really upset. She's going to participate in the Komen Walk for breast cancer this spring in her mother's honor. She's making a cookbook for her siblings with all their mother's recipes as a gift later this year. So this is normal grief. Even though Maria feels miserable, she's crying, she's even missing a little work, she's able to go to work. But you know, if she was this close to her mom and it's just only been 6 months, and you lose your precious mom, it's, you know, you're going to have a lot of reactions and it's going to be ups and downs, and crying 2 to 3 times a week is not very much. I mean, it would not be unusual even after 6 months to cry every day for a while, right? And just have a moment where you just let some tears out. So this is pretty normal, but it's rough, right? It's rough. And this is a time, like I said, that 6 months time when people really need some support. All right, so if people are having complicated grief, what do you do? They really need a grief specialist. Sometimes it's hard to find them. Like I said, a lot of counselors are like, oh yeah, I know grief. I was kind of like that, kind of dumb and cocky, right? And I realize what it's so, but sometimes I think Psychology Today is a great way to find a counselor, and they'll tell you what insurances they take. With Medicaid, I think it is trickier. You end up trying to explain to someone at the community mental health center, like, we need someone who really knows grief. No, like really knows grief. So you try to ask for that. Sometimes people that are complicated grievers, they may not do well in a support group because they've got a lot going on and they may kind of take up all the oxygen in the room, but it also could be helpful. So usually the person doing the support group will call them ahead of time and kind of size them up a little bit. But, you know, that's just a caution to think about, that, you know, it could be helpful for them, but it could be, sometimes if people are not doing great, it can be even more activating for them to go to a support group and can make things more difficult, which is counterintuitive, I know, right? All right. Well, let's move into, just a couple things about special populations here. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I want us to have a little time at the end, but you know, older adults and kids both have special things to think about that are difficult. Older adults have more physical complaints, and it can affect their cognitive functioning for a while, right? Because grief affects your concentration and your ability to remember things. So if you're doing a mental status exam on somebody trying to see if their memory's impaired, if they've had a recent loss, it may be because of that. So take that into consideration. And also with kids, sometimes kids are like, oh, you know, they're only a year old, they're probably not grieving. But if they're old enough to love, they're old enough to grieve. And so even like infants will have grief reactions. They don't have verbal grief reactions, but usually kids go back a stage or 2 in development. A grieving kid who was potty trained may go backward and need pull-ups again, right? Because, you know, you will have some kind of manifestation. Usually kids cope with grief and loss through play. Sometimes they act out in a response to grief versus talking about feelings. And kids do grief in doses. I mean, they can be like super upset and then like flip a switch and then be totally fine. And parents kind of freak out about that. They're like, oh, that doesn't seem normal. But they don't sustain sad feelings like adults can. They kind of just do it in bursts or doses. Kids really benefit from social support. There are so many cool kids grief camps all over Indiana that kids can come to. There's Camp Healing Tree, there's Camp Aaron. I don't know how they've been faring with COVID, but hopefully they're getting resurrected. There are great grief centers all over Indiana. Brooks Place, I cannot highly recommend enough in Indianapolis. But there's Fort Wayne, South Bend. I'm not sure about Southern Indiana, but there are tons of neat places that are just for kids now, and they're almost always all free and funded by donations. So I have Brooks Place as noted on the bottom, and I'm sure you could call them and they could tell you about other places in the state that have centers for grieving kids. So just a little bit about that. Okay, how do we move through grief? Let's talk a little bit about some tasks of mourning. So this is the part where if you want to help people, how do you help them? And again, we're not going to focus on Kubler-Ross, that denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. They're about stages of dying, and we're not meant to describe bereavement. So here's the model that describes bereavement, the 4 tasks model. William Worden, that's his little book over there. And he said there are 4 things that every grieving person needs to do. And we're going to talk about each one of those quickly here. One is to accept the reality of the loss. Seems simple, right? Well, believe that it happened. Yeah, but it takes a long time for your mind and your heart to catch up. You can know something happened in your mind, but your heart doesn't know it for a really long time. You just can't believe it. It takes a long time for you to catch up. So what we try to do to help people to accept the reality is let them talk. Let them talk. Let them talk. Let them tell the story. Don't say, oh, you've already told me that. Yeah, you've mentioned that before. Nope, let them tell it again, because I don't think we ever tell the same story twice. We're getting our stuff out by talking about it. So yeah, and doing something, encourage people to do active things to encourage mourning, like looking at pictures. Some people think visiting a grave is helpful. Some people are like, I want no part of that. It's okay, whatever they decide to do. But again, journaling, talking, just to accept the reality of it is really helpful. And like I said, this takes longer. This is not like a 4 or 5 day thing. This is like a 4 or 5 weeks or even a few months. I know for me, when my dad died, I was a teenager. My dad suddenly died at a church basketball game of a heart attack. I would answer the phone. We would get solicitor calls or something. He was a farmer, somebody trying to sell us fertilizer, and they'd say, hey, is Larry there? And I would be like, just a minute. And I would be like, starting to walk to go get him. And this was months after he died. And I was like, oh my gosh, now I have to go back on the phone and tell these people he's dead. It was so weird. It's just so funny how it takes a lot longer to do this than what you think. I like this quote, I will always wake up every day only to remember you are not here and feel that ache all over again. That's true. Like, it takes you a while to really, every day you have to remember it for a while. So task 2, processing the pain of grief. As I mentioned, there is no way to escape it. It's like a giant mud puddle across the road. You have to walk through it. You cannot go around it very well. So how do you help somebody process pain? You validate their feelings. Anger, it's okay. Some people are angry, some people aren't. And then sometimes people get very much like they sort of deify the person. They were amazing. You can't speak ill of the dead. But sometimes it's just helpful to give them a place to talk about the balance. What do you miss? And maybe what do you not miss? You know, that this was a real person. It helps them process what happened and keep it grounded a little bit. That would not be something I would do immediately. I would wait for a while to do that kind of a conversation. And remember I talked about the shoulda, coulda, wouldas? So reality testing the guilt can be helpful. And when people say, oh, I should have done this, and they're like, yeah, I can hear that, you know, you have some regrets. Well, what did you do? How did you try to help them? What else? You know, keep soliciting, like what else you do, because people need to realize that for the most people, they did do something. Now, if there's that rare person that's like really, truly didn't do what they should have done, sometimes you just listen and say, that's a hard place to be. I know that's hard, you know, and the only hope is that they can find a place of self-compassion and self-forgiveness at some point. And that's not easy. I think I encourage people to dose themselves with grief. Like, you know, allow yourself, you know, a half hour a day to cry, but also do something kind to yourself. What grounds you? What gives you joy? Is it being in nature? Is it ice cream? You know, grief and ice cream go well together, or chocolate. I'm always about the chocolate and the ice cream for grief. It's like somehow magical medicine. If those are your jams, you may have other jams. But encourage people to do self-care. I like this quote too. Grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing, and sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it's overwhelming. It knocks you down, right? Those kind of waves of grief, and all we can do is learn to swim. So grief is just crazy like that. The feelings are just all over the map. Task 3 is to adjust to a world without the deceased. Wow, simple words, huge thing. So there are really 3 things that a bereaved person needs to do, a griever. They have to externally adjust, like their everyday lives are affected, right? You have to take on new roles. I've seen like older couples where maybe the wife she's the survivor and she's never written a check. She has no idea about the money. And I've seen the husband be the same way, or a man that doesn't know how to cook or doesn't remember his kids' birthdays because she took care of all of that. It's a lot to adjust to. And then internal adjustments, like who am I now without this person? Am I still a mom if my child has died? And spiritual adjustments. Death can really shake your assumptive world about how things are supposed to be. Like, you know, God, why did this happen? Why did this happen now? Why couldn't you spare us? And even if it doesn't completely shake your faith to the ground, it does maybe make you ask a lot of whys. And I think as a friend, or if this is one of your clients, just sometimes you're helping them with just some problem solving situations. You guys probably have done that for people. People need help making decisions and problem solving for a while because you're not thinking clearly. We always tell people, if you don't have to, some people are immediately financially distressed and have to move or have to get a job. But if you don't have to, it's nice not to be able to make a bunch of major decisions because you just are not thinking clearly. You think you are, but you're not. And sometimes getting people to seek some spiritual counseling is really helpful. But again, listening to people talk without judgment and really supporting to all the great whys that they have. The irony of grief is that the person that you need to talk to about how you feel is the person who is no longer here. The fourth and final task is to go on living while keeping a connection to the deceased. Like when someone dies, you don't lose the relationship with them. You lose the physicality of them, but there's so much a part of you that you couldn't take that part of them out of you without losing who you are. And so keeping that part of you alive that is different and changed and transformed because of them is really important. So honoring that person, talking about them, keeping them close is really, really good. And then I also think people need to just have someone helping them make decisions, and people lose some confidence and some competence after a significant person dies, and they need a lot of support with just moving on with their life in that way. I think rituals are so important, like balloon releases, lighting candles, remembering the person, making a scrapbook, taking a moment to remember them at a family gathering. Those things are really nice. Going on a trip at some place that you went with them before and remembering them. Those things are hard, but man, they're meaningful and they really help you heal. There's just a nice little ritual picture there. But here's getting here close to the end, just some general recommendations to help grieving clients or family members. Is to invite them to talk about their relationship and learn about the quality. Don't feel pressured to fix it. That was a nice thing for me. I don't have to fix your grief. I don't have to give you advice. I don't have to tell you what to do. By listening, by witnessing, by validating what you're experiencing, I am helping you a whole lot. Just being a witness is so valuable. And creating that safe, non-judgmental space, right? So they can talk to you, letting them tell the story if they want to, right? Ask them about what's it been like since the death and look at their support system. How are they doing? Because when people are early in the process, you're still deciding, is this pretty normal stuff, or are we starting to take that turn toward maybe some complicated grief? Are they mourning? To me is the big thing. They've got grief feelings. Are they doing things? Are they talking? Are they journaling? Do they have a good friend that they're having coffee with? You know, is their religious community still something that they're reaching out to? If this is someone you don't see very much or someone that you don't have a lot of relationship with, you know, express sympathy. I always think it's okay to say, I'm sorry to hear about your loss. That sounds really hard. Who tell me about the person that you lost? It was your mom. What was your mom's name? Alice, right? And then just tell me how it's been for you. You know, those are just simple things that you can do. Yeah, I think saying the name of that person is sometimes really nice. Even if you make people cry, for the most part, people like to remember. If we try to protect people's feelings and don't want to make them cry, then they lose the opportunity to talk about that person, and that's what heals. It's the mourning that heals you, right? Last quote here, reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. Lots of grief resources out there now. A lot of churches are doing grief share. I mentioned Alan Wolfelt, so there are a lot of things. If you need some specific grief resources, I'm glad to be a resource for that too, to try to help connect you to some references. And that is what I had to share with you today. Let me see if I can stop the share here. Did I stop the share maybe?
You can just leave it right there if you're comfortable with showing the picture that we see. It's a beautiful picture.
Oh, the dog. All right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
How do I
just leave it right?
Let's see.
There
Okay.
we go.
I
There we
the
go.
screen
Yeah.
All right.
Thank
There you
you.
go. Okay.
Yes.
Sure.
Well, thank you so very much. That was very good information, and I can tell by the comments that have been entered that it was very much appreciated. So we do actually have a couple of questions that has been entered that I'll share with you just to get your thoughts on those. Someone has said that a few times during the year following the anniversaries of the deaths of very important people in their life, they have a difficult time functioning. And the question is, what can they do to not let those times overwhelm them?
Well, great question. I did not mention the anniversary phenomenon, but most people have, even if you don't remember the actual date of the death, or you kind of aren't tracking the person's birthday, like your body knows, and you start to feel worse, you start to have memories, you start to feel more tender, more teary. I think anniversaries and holidays do cause grief bursts. And so what can you do to, I don't think you can eliminate them, of course, because you're still processing all of that. But sometimes if you anticipate them and you do something intentional, like, hey, this 1-year anniversary is coming up of my mom's death, and I know it's going to be a rough day. So I'm just going to plan to take a mental health day at work that day. And I'm going to watch Netflix all day, or I'm going to go do something that it reminds me of my mom that makes me feel happy, or I'm going to go walk out in nature, or I'm going to eat ice cream, whatever it is in her honor, So anticipation and a plan can be helpful.
Very, very good suggestion. I know that we all have that. I know for my father, we drink a martini in his honor because he did like a martini every now and then. So we do a toast to him.
Remember him. That's very awesome. I love that you have this ritual. That's great.
So a couple of people have asked about the resources that you showed at the end. And just as a reminder, this will be posted on our website. Also, when we send out the email, it will have a link to the website where you can access all of the resources and the recording, as well as, again, the resources. So that will be available to everyone. Let's see.
And I know
someone is.
I don't have
right ahead.
Yeah, I know I don't have a great list of everything across Indiana, because I know all of you folks are from all over the place, but yeah, there are so many local things in every community. Grief stuff has gotten so much better, so much more grief support, especially for kids. I'm very impressed, but the more rural you get, of course, the tougher it is to access those things without quite a bit of traveling.
Right. Someone has asked that a grandfather has passed away on their daughter's 10th birthday. So any suggestions on when, obviously that's a sad thing, but also a happy thing because it's a birthday. So any suggestions on how to kind of deal with that?
I mean, sometimes it's there, so it's the elephant in the room. Acknowledging it is important, and maybe you light a candle for grandpa that you let burn all day. and have his picture by the candle, or you burn it for like just in the evening before you go to bed, but you still then go on and have the normal birthday, right? Because life is about grief and life is about celebration, and they're all mixed up at the same time. So acknowledging that grandpa passed away, I don't know if it's recent, if it's just this is the first time, or if it's been an anniversary. Probably this is the first time. So I think it is hard to do both things. And sometimes you have to do a makeup birthday. Like, this is going to be a hard birthday. So we're going to have a little celebration for you, but we also want to think about grandpa, but we're going to do a birthday on your redo in another month or another few weeks here, because we want you to have a moment. We all need a moment, and then we'll celebrate too. But life is always about that, right? Grief in the midst of celebrations. It's so weird how we can do both, but we can.
I think we have time for, if anybody has any other questions, if you want to put those in now. We have a few more minutes, but if we don't get to all of them, we will try to get them answered and include that on the Q&A that we will post along with the other information on our website. Again, that's go to IPMG.com. It's located in the resources tab at the top under informational webinars. Someone has asked if the steps that you discussed for grief would be the same for those that are going through a divorce.
Wow, such a great question. I think you modify those some for the divorce. I think the hard thing about a divorce is that you are letting go of a life and a future that you had imagined, and that person is still around. And if you're co-parenting, sometimes that just keeps everything activated. So I think it's different. I think divorce has its own unique challenges. So I'd say there's some things that are similar in dealing with all the feelings, but I think that divorce is a much different animal, so complicated in so many ways. So get support. If you're going through a divorce, I've been there and done that, and it would have been a good thing for me to even up the level of support that I got at the time. I thought I got some good support, but I think I needed even more now that I look back. It's hard stuff. So going through it right now, my heart goes out to you.
And then someone is asking about resources or recommendations that you might have for them to be able to support their daughter who has Down syndrome, and she has difficulty moving past death. She said it says whether it was a classmate, a family member, or an acquaintance, she feels this at the same level for years. So any suggestions on any books or any resources to help her daughter who has Down syndrome?
I would, if I were you, I would contact brooksplace.org. And Brooke is a girl who lost her dad. And like there's Aaron's Place, I think, in Fort Wayne. And I know there's one in South, but there's a lot of them across the state. But they usually have a grief library, or there's someone there that is a resource person that could recommend a book. But ritual is really important. Balloon releases, making a special food for that person, doing some kind of a ritual moves us forward. And that might be very helpful if people are fairly concrete and are not processing feelings. Actions are really helpful. So, whatever that would look like, some kind of a ritual, planting a tree or a bush and watering that tree, and that this is a bush in honor of this person who died and we're going to take care of it, or whatever, just got to keep it alive, right? But so rituals are really
That's a very good suggestion. Thank you so much. Well, I think we are at the end of our time today, but I do want to thank you, Dr. Glassburn, for taking your time to share this with us. It's been a great informational webinar, and I know that the participants, the attendees feel that. I can see that in the comments and questions that they've entered. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you all for attending. Again, just a quick reminder, we will have a survey that launches at the close of the webinar. The link to the survey is also included in the follow-up email. along with that attendance certificate if that is something that you need. Would like to let everyone know that we will not be having an informational webinar in April due to IPMG's virtual company event that will be taking place, but we will be back again in May on May the 20th, and the topic of that informational webinar is on hoarding, and information about that along with registration will be sent out soon, so please look for that to be emailed out in the very near future. So thank you all again. I hope that you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Thank you for joining us.